Forward. In my experience as a correctional officer for 25 years, I've been conditioned, and sometimes that acclimatization into the environmental culture is demonstrated in my works. Conditioning forms habits. Habits become expectations, and expectations create cultures and subcultures. Now retired, I'm drifting away from the pitfalls of such bias and focus building realities and stronger evidentiary opportunities rather than simple conclusions. You will see the word culture throughout the report, and hence, to you, this is the basis for fact-finding in this specific profession. Confirmation of truths, or perceived truths, or as is believed to be the case, a design truth, based on rather ingenious gathering of evidence, is purely subjective, ignored to allow the culture to establish the appropriate approach and delivery in the manner such reports are formulated. From the earliest days in our careers, we've learned that a short, simple writing style is preferred, and to try to keep it at a sixth grade reading level. The reason isn't so much an argument for lack of intelligence as it is to the reader's time to do a sufficient review, and a relatively low comprehension level, making it hitting the high points a cursory review. It is up to the reader to want to look into the details. This is the danger of submitting brief reports filled with biases. The conditioning is compounded at the management levels, accepting the context of a synopsis when the details may well show a different circumstance, once the facts are reviewed. Again, the interest must lie within the reader to be willing to dig into the details. Completing the review of the recently released Arizona Department of Corrections Kingman Riot After Report, it is with great reluctance to consider this lengthy document a legitimate and clear, concise description of the event. In my opinion, this document was written in such a formal and format, traditional ADCOC disciplinary report process, rather than a format that balances both sides of the story, making it easier for the writer and the reader to state their finding of facts and deny those persons or parties accused to show either sole culpability or joint responsibility in the acts described. Completing the review of the recently released Arizona Department of Corrections Kingman Riot After Report, it is with great reluctance to consider this lengthy document a legitimate and clear, concise description of the event. In my opinion, this document was written in such a formal and format, traditional ADCOC disciplinary report process, rather than a format that balances both sides of the story, making it easier for the writer and the reader to state their finding of facts and deny those persons or parties accused to show either sole culpability or joint responsibility in the acts described. One can read into this report from the beginning as being a declaration of denial. It's a prime example of political immunity of the Management Training Corporation, known as MTC, by the Department of Corrections. This report is questionable in credibility for several reasons, but those will be discussed in the body of my paper. The facts, based on non-scientific evidence and inferences, retrieved photographs and documents as they occurred or gathered during this time. While at the same time, I reserve the right to make notations, this report is problematic in many areas discussed in depth as this significant white paper is written. It was hoped this report would be focused on the root problems and offer solutions. It appears rather the opposite took place, and this investigative report related to the Kingman July riots is a mere discussion relating to the indictment of the Management Training Corporation and exonerates the Department of Corrections from any joint responsibility other than the excessive force usage of their tactical units, which in itself was a responsive factor and not the original root cause of the problems identified and requested to be looked into by the governor. There are two formats used in this report: the primary Arizona Agent Report 1 and 2, as well as a summary of the investigative findings and exhibits supporting such conclusions. The primary agent for this report was the Director of Corrections, who by executive order was directed to investigate the Kingman riots. Upon receiving such an order, the director gathered a multidisciplinary team of his own choice. The team he chose were state employees serving at will, men and women under his command, and employees who may have a direct or indirect involvement of the incident, at the Kingman complex. In essence, these men and women were being directed to investigate their boss and their business relationship with MTC, and how well the contract was adhered to, and how these riots incubated and grew into a disastrous proportion reported to the governor. The format the Arizona Department of Corrections chose to follow resembles an internal Department Order 601 procedure, which is commonly referred to as the Employee Misconduct Report, rather than a balance of both sides interacting with each other as a joint hybrid governance stipulation required, giving the report an impression which reflects political immunity and complete autonomy in the management and operational principles of MTC organization. One can suggest that MTC was disallowed to participate due to the implied guilt of negligence and insufficient management leadership findings. Secondary, this team was gathered for the purpose of finding facts relevant to the riots and chose not to go beyond any political boundaries to see why the contract was so loosely managed and oversight was so lax to give MTC the benefit of the doubt whenever they were in non-compliance. The facts gleaned demonstrated a propensity to rely on hearsay, selective, injected, and one-sided documents, memory recalled, and interviews under less than sterile conditions by individuals who lacked the correct method to conduct or maintain such an interview. In other words, the agent in charge, Director Charles Ryan, had the authority to approve, design, or request the most appropriate format for the governor's request. Such an act itself could constitute a conflict of interest and should be considered in the conclusion of his report. The purpose of an investigative report is to logically present the basis for, extent of, and results of an investigation. Commonalities are the report must be written so that the reader can comprehend all substantive facts, circumstances related to the investigation, be convinced of the thoroughness and impartiality of the investigation, draw the same conclusions as the director, and agree with the recommendations made based upon the evidence presented or formulated for such an outcome. And finally, attach exhibits of all relevant findings and information included in the report. Some disturbing indicators were every staff interviewed had a standard worded prelude with the statement was asked to describe his or her responses to the disturbances at Surbat or Hulapai units. He or she was asked to describe what he knew, when he knew it, and what he did about it, indicating that these reports were based on inferences, hearsay, and non-evidentiary nature. This is neither scientific, but rather pure anecdotal in nature, nor admissible unless convoyed with an affidavit or written statement matching such statement. There are notations made that are rather subjective in nature and not challenged in the report, identifying imperfect individualities, personality traits, or professional skill levels. One would assume the Arizona Department of Corrections gathers psychological profiles to back up such personal and critical comments, and if not, they should be ignored. One finding I find seriously disturbing is the investigation of Officer J. Kemp, which reads in part, based on comments made by inmates regarding how Officer Kemp's action may have possibly sparked the disturbance at Hulapai, I conducted 2 interviews with supervisory staff at Surbat unit focusing on Officer Kemp's previous performance. One would hope the Department of Corrections has the experience, skill, and knowledge to address, identify, and list all discrepancies and record relevant conduct that is more appropriate or inappropriate. Therefore, an explanation of the MTC counterstatements is missing, and summaries of individual witness statements, for example, inmate witnesses, were collated into a subjective or presumptuous manner. There are no recommendations in this report, with the exception of statements made in the theory of investigation and conclusions, supported by evidence citations. Therefore, it's reasonable there is a deliberate, inescapable supposition or determination of canceling contract services before the report was finalized and written for review. In the conclusion, the report itself states, based upon the observations and reviews of available materials, inmate interviews, staff contacts, and interviews, the assessment team concluded that the inmate population at ASP Kingman was dissatisfied with their conditions of confinement. Thus, they rebelled by way of rioting. Those singular events on the days of disturbances can be identified as inciting the actions of the inmates on July 1st through July 4th, 2015. Identified operational issues cannot be discounted as contributing factors. Hardly this report contains such a regimented format to allow positive conclusions to be drawn based on actual and factual information. This is barely a complaint for due process, since the purpose of this report is clear: indict MTC. If this case were to be handled by attorneys and the case goes to court, one might have to suppose, gather, or conjecture what is said is what the individual meant. Since the bulk of these interviews are from those involved as active and passive contributors and witnesses, one cannot compare the findings without matching statements. This makes the entire report questionable in content, challenges legitimacy and intent for such a delivery of perceptions and subjective comments to the governor's office. It is thereby presumed by the reader, the governor, and the director his assessment team had the ability to interpret all interviews of all key witnesses or take any and all investigative steps that would normally have been expected, as there is no section of the report to report otherwise. One final observation was the comment made by Director Ryan regarding the lack of compliance of ADC policies and procedures by MTC organization. One cannot be so unable to speak, most typically because of congenital deafness, be so blind or sightless or lacking the specific knowledge or awareness of the contract or policies, and therefore make an uneducated or unsophisticated decision, not know the MTC organization was out of compliance with a host of department orders. A dreadful condition to allow to exist when public safety is in jeopardy. Unless one had given them so much leeway, so much autonomy, and a significant part of the burden to regulate themselves, rather than the numerous monitors hired by the agency to do exactly that: monitor compliance to all ADC policies and procedures. The bottom line is simply this: there is no factual finding of these riots. There's a collective, collated effort to point the arrow of blame into the direction of the MTC organization for not following ADC policy and procedures, a mandatory required for contractual services to be rendered and paid for. The truth is somewhere between what MTC didn't do and what the ADC should have done to ensure compliance. Stating the obvious that MTC managed to hide all these facts from the ADC monitors, thereby making MTC disingenuous and nefarious in nature, should have been the basis for a deeper look into these events and come out with a balanced view rather than a one-dimensional desire to burn MTC and exonerate ADC from all liabilities, bungling, or contractual oversight responsibilities. Thank you for watching.